In 1913, a Jewish girls' school in Vilna called Yehudiya, designed to provide supplementary education for girls aged 7 to 18, published a publicity pamphlet in Yiddish that lamented the alienation of young Jewish women from Jewish culture and from the Jewish people. Once, stated the pamphlet, the Jewish daughter ceaselessly absorbed Jewish culture from the day of her birth. She was taught no Torah, but the spirit of the Torah already soared over her cradle. In our times, noted the pamphlet in contrast, a girl receives no knowledge at all of Yiddishkeit. The first song that she hears is already not a Jewish one. The first letter she learns is not from Aleph Beis. The first little story she reads is of foreign life in a foreign tongue. Years go by. The girl becomes ever more distanced from her people, from its culture, from its traditions, from its pride in its past, from its concerns in the present, from its hopes for the future. This is a surprising quote to find in one of the most important centers of traditional Jewish life on the eve of the First World War. What does such a text represent? Were the Jews of Poland and Lithuania simply following the assimilatory path blazed by their Central European kin some 2 or 3 generations earlier? Or was the author of this pamphlet indulging in the pessimistic discourse that has led critics of Jewish communities in all ages to portray their contemporaries as deviants from a glorious past characterized by learning and by righteous behavior? What social phenomenon was the pamphlet and the school it promoted attempting to address? By the first decade of the 20th century, it was apparent to most East European Jews that their traditional culture was undergoing a process of transformation. Concentrated above all in the Russian Pale of Settlement, they constituted the largest Jewish population of the world. Yet the economic foundations of Russian Jewry had been undermined by a combination of industrial development and restrictive governmental policy. The role of the Jews as middlemen between the rural and urban markets had been significantly diminished by the building of railroads, the freeing of the serfs, and the new entrepreneurship displayed by the nobility. The government also sought to exclude Jews from key sectors of the economy. In an effort to assimilate them into Russian society and erode their traditional culture, the government had established schools for Jewish children and had trained more than 2 generations of a Russified elite. Jews were also accepted into general governmental schools. The Haskalah movement in Russia, the Jewish Enlightenment movement, had disseminated its rationalist message of self-improvement and called upon Jews to be open to secular European culture. Looking to the West, Maskilim, those who followed the Haskalah, held fast to the vision of emancipation and social integration that had been proclaimed and at least partially realized in France, Germany, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. An increasingly urbanized Jewish population had access to the newspapers and books that promoted a secular consciousness. Although the vast majority of Jews in Eastern Europe remained traditionally educated and religiously observant, an articulate lay leadership competed with the rabbinic elite and their allies and offered a variety of secular Jewish strategies for the fashioning of Jewish life and identity in the modern world. The traditional Jewish populations of Eastern Europe were experiencing a process of assimilation. The socioeconomic, political, and cultural contexts of their assimilation, however, differed dramatically from those of Western Jews, and the roles and representation of women diverged accordingly from the Western model. And I guess what I'm going to be presenting today is a kind of Eastern model. In the Russian Empire of the late 19th century, the process of assimilation can best be characterized as secularization. Traditional Jewish practice and learning declined significantly in the West, but Jews accommodated to the religious sentiment of the dominant bourgeois cultures of Western societies by fashioning modern versions of Judaism. In fact, in post-emancipation Western communities, the self-definition of Jews was as members of a religious minority, even for those Jews who no longer observed most Jewish ritual. There was no similar pressure in Eastern Europe for Jews to reform their religion and assert an identity based upon religious affiliation. Instead, Jews who had broken with traditional Judaism tended to define themselves in terms of ethnicity. The Russian Empire, then as now, was multi-ethnic. Jews were thus not alone in basing their identity on ethnic characteristics such as shared language, culture, and history. The modernizing sectors of Russian society were themselves secularized. The majority of Jews had no hopes of rapidly achieving middle-class status like their kin to the West, and the ideologies that spoke to youth who had abandoned traditional religion, whether they were Jews or Gentiles, were political ideologies. Moreover, it was simpler for Jews who sought acculturation and integration to abandon Jewish observance than to institute religious reform. These modernizing Jews confronted far more opposition than in the West, for the institutions and leadership of traditional Judaism continued to dominate the East European kahila, the community, which remained responsible for Jewish education and for mobilizing the support of large numbers of Jews. As the stories of Shalom Aleichem reveal so poignantly, Jewish society in Russia was fractured along generational, class, and cultural lines. Some Jewish women seem to have been particularly vulnerable to the attraction of secular culture and political movements because of the gender divisions that prevailed in traditional Jewish society regarding educational strategies. According to halakha, Jewish law, women were exempt from the study of Torah, by which was meant the texts of the Hebrew Bible and of rabbinic learning, whose mastery conferred status upon Jewish men. In practice, this exemption became social exclusion. Traditional East European Jews continued to provide a classical Torah education for their sons in chadarim and yeshivot, although with increasing frequency, Orthodox parents chose to enroll their sons in modern Jewish private schools. In 1898-99, almost 54% of Jewish boys still attended chadarim. However, the same families that chose for their sons various forms of private Jewish education, whether of traditional or modernized curriculum, sent their daughters to public primary schools where they were introduced to secular culture, or they hired private tutors to instruct their daughters primarily in secular subjects. Most of these parents paid little attention to their daughters' formal Jewish education. It was rare for observant parents to include classical Jewish learning in their daughters' curriculum. Pur Rakovsky's father, and you'll be hearing more about Pur Rakovsky in the course of this lecture, Pur Rakovsky's father, a traditionally observant Jew, did so for his adolescent daughter in Bialystok of the late 1870s because she was so enthralled by Jewish texts and so extraordinarily talented in their study. In her memoirs, Rakovsky reported her father commenting ruefully, "It's a shame you were born a girl and not a boy." The assertion of a fundamental accident of birth was necessary to rationalize an exception to the rule in the gender division of Jewish education. The directors of Vilna's Yehudiya school were assailing the common decision of Russian Jews to restrict the formal education of their daughters to secular subjects. In the modern world, they asserted, living in a Jewish household was not sufficient to guarantee a strong Jewish consciousness for youth whose book learning was limited to European texts taught in a non-Jewish social context. Yehudiya offered its 200 students 3 hours of instruction a day after the conclusion of public school, in Hebrew language, Bible, Mishnah, Midrash, and Jewish history in order to instill a Jewish nationalist consciousness. Jewish nationalists were not the only ones to recognize the consequences of ignoring the Jewish education of girls. Beginning in the late 18th century in Central Europe and continuing into the 19th in Eastern Europe, Maskilim had succeeded in establishing schools for poor girls precisely because their education was of little concern to the Orthodox elite. Schooling for girls under auspices other than the Orthodox communities did not entail Bitul Torah, diversion from Torah study. The Haskalah poet Judah Lieb Gordon explicitly used this argument to his own advantage when in 1866 he established a girls' academy in Telsha. The misguided opposition to modern education on the part of traditionalist Jews, he asserted, extended only to boys. There should be no obstacles to providing a modern education for girls. By the early years of the 20th century, even some Orthodox figures expressed concern about the type of education that girls received in the traditional community. In 1903, at a conference of Polish rabbis, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Lanz, a Hasidic leader, criticized the neglect of girls' Jewish education and called for the creation of Orthodox Jewish schools for girls. His call fell upon deaf ears. About a decade and a half later, however, Sarah Schenerer, a seamstress and the daughter of a Hasidic family, established a study group for women in Krakow. Eager to spread Torah education among girls, she secured the support of the Belzer Rebbe, a crucial step that provided rabbinical authorization for her radical idea. And in 1918, she opened the first Beis Yaakov school. The following year, the school was absorbed by the Orthodox political organization Agudas Yisrael as its educational agency for women. From then on, the Aguda promoted Jewish education among women, extending the Beis Yaakov schools throughout Poland and to Lithuania, Latvia, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, and Austria. The common recognition by secular nationalists and Orthodox Jews alike of the deleterious consequences of neglecting girls' Jewish education is eloquent testimony to the widespread perception of the problem. In the absence of communal attention, Jewish girls might be lost to the Jewish community. Although we have evidence of the concern expressed by Jewish leaders, both traditional and modern, about the increasing assimilation of Jewish women, we have little information from the women themselves. The loss of faith as prelude to or concomitant with the acquisition of secular culture was a frequent theme in Hebrew literature of the late Haskalah. But that literature was the province of male writers. Jewish women were not part of literary circles of the time. In their autobiographical writing, leading maskilim like Abraham Ber Gottlieb and Moses Lilienblum recounted how the stifling education of the cheder and the yeshiva contributed to the erosion of their faith. In Haskalah and secular education, they found a substitute religion that offered them the possibility for self-transformation and for leading their brethren into new paths of redemption. Because of the phenomenon of early marriage for the intellectually precocious adolescent male, women, both wives and mothers-in-law, figured in their stories as obstacles to self-realization and modernization. The few women who have described their experiences in memoirs were not literary personalities. Most wrote in Yiddish or in English when dealing with immigrants, some 2 generations or more after the appearance of the famous Haskalah autobiographies, in order to record the enormous transformations that had occurred in their own lifetimes as a result of secularization and emigration. Most seem to have accepted a gradual erosion of traditional Jewish practice as a normal part of relocation in a large city and entry into the workforce. Pua Rakovsky, however, offers a different model. At the age of 13, while studying with her private tutor, she was suddenly struck by the awful realization that there may be no God. After wrestling with the idea for 6 months, she decided that atheism was the right course, and she never changed her mind about this, and she abandoned the regimen of regular prayer and strict observance that she had followed as a spiritual adolescent living in an Orthodox home. The gendered division of education among East European Jews was not the only factor facilitating the secularization of Jewish girls and women. The middle-class cult of domesticity that prevailed among Jews in Western countries by the second half of the 19th century did not penetrate deeply into the lives of Russian Jews. To be sure, the Maskilim who promoted modern education for Jewish children of both sexes presumed that girls educated in the spirit of the Haskalah would acquire all of the qualities of the European bourgeois woman. However, the vast majority of Jewish women in 19th and early 20th century Eastern Europe grew to maturity in a society that did not facilitate the division between the public and domestic realms that was essential for the emergence of the middle-class lady. Jewish women of necessity participated actively in secular public economic life. Although they were excluded from voting or assuming positions of leadership within the Kehillah and from public roles within the synagogue, they assumed responsibility for contributing to the support of their households. There also existed an elite of learned families that realized the Ashkenazi cultural ideal of full-time Torah study for men, a situation which imposed upon wives the primary obligation for sustaining the family economically. The overwhelming majority of East European Jewish males, however, had neither the talent, the education, nor the resources to become Torah scholars. They worked as merchants, as peddlers, or as artisans. The existence of the cultural ideal of male learning and female labor, however, legitimated the presence of women in the world of commerce and manufacture, as well as their cultivation of character traits that would ensure the survival of the family. Memoirs of East European Jews describing their childhoods from the last third of the 19th century and through the First World War are replete with references to mothers whose work as seamstresses, storekeepers, peddlers, or even sellers of whiskey to the local peasants kept food on their families' tables. The strong, capable woman was the dominant cultural ideal, rather than the creator of a domestic haven that served as the prevalent ideal in the bourgeois West. As the historian Susan Glenn has recently pointed out, most Jewish marriages in Eastern Europe involved a breadwinning partnership that gave Jewish wives some family authority, a knowledge of the marketplace, and a certain worldliness. Although the Russian census of 1897 counted only about 21% of Jewish women between the ages of 14 and 59 as economically active, that is, as engaged in income-earning labor outside the home, that figure actually understates women's economic role, since women who assisted their husbands in family businesses or ran the businesses during their husbands' frequent absences were not considered by census takers to be working. Although wealthy East European Jewish men sought a purely domestic role for their wives, as did their compatriots to the West, the presence of a large proportion of adult Jewish females in the public economic sphere conferred upon women a measure of independence and a variety of social contexts that were not possible for middle-class women, whose lives were bounded by the social norms of the bourgeois cult of domesticity. The social and cultural contexts in Eastern Europe thus facilitated the assimilation of women. Consequently, the proportion of Jewish women in Eastern Europe who took the lead in the process of assimilation was greater than in the countries of Western and Central Europe or the United States. To be sure, even in interwar Poland, which acquired its independence after the First World War, a substantial segment of East European Jews remained traditional in their self-consciousness and their religious observance until their murder by the Nazis. The women among them, although they modernized their clothing in the interwar years, remained Yiddish-speaking models of religious piety, modest in dress, strongly committed to traditional culture, and still involved in commerce. Over the course of several generations, however, from the second half of the 19th century and through the interwar years, the majority of East European Jewish women had secularized and adapted to the culture of their respective social classes. Among those who radically assimilated, and it's a very small group, by converting to Christianity, women appear to have taken an increasingly prominent role. A recent study of the conversion records of the Lithuanian consistory of the Russian Orthodox Church, covering the years 1819 to 1911, and providing information on 244 Jewish converts, reveals that from the 1860s on, women accounted for the majority of the converts. Like the men, most of the women converts came from the poorest stratum of Russian Jewry. They were, in the historian Michael Stanislavski's words, the destitute and the desperate. Since single women were far more numerous than single men among the converts, it is likely that women of the lower classes, whose possibilities for marriage in the Jewish community were limited because of their lack of dowry, were converting to marry Christian men of the same social level, whom they had met initially through economic contacts. While recognizing the danger of generalizing from such a small sample, remember it was 244, of the 69,400 Jews who converted to Russian Orthodoxy during the 19th century, Stanislavski suggests tentatively that the disproportionate representation of women among the Jewish converts in the latter half of the period points to the lesser success of women in accommodating to the new social, economic, political, and cultural conditions than their brothers, husbands, and sons. These limited conversion records, then, would substantiate the assessment of Jewish educators of a variety of ideological perspectives that women were less well prepared for their encounter with Russian society once the barriers of Jewish segregation were lowered. Jewish women's vulnerability to the lure of the larger society, whether perceived as Christian or secular, was a product of their situation. Trained by the gender division of traditional Jewish society to take initiative, at least economically, respected for their abilities to manage, aware of the value attached to learning from which they were excluded, Jewish women who had lost their faith and had contact with secular culture pursued the opportunities that they perceived newly open to them. Thus, despite anti-Jewish discrimination, some Jewish women of the middle and upper classes made heroic efforts to acquire secondary education, enrolling in gymnasia, academic high schools, or after the introduction of a strict quota, a numerus clausus, in 1887, studying privately as externs to take the exams that would prepare them for university courses. Despite the fact that she was married and the mother of two, the 20-year-old Pua Rakovsky, for example, managed in 1885 to persuade her husband and her parents, who temporarily assumed care of her children, to permit her to study to become a teacher. Her ostensible goal was to enable her to support her family better, while her husband, who had lost all of her dowry, devoted much of his time to Torah learning. Her real goal, in addition to satisfying her profound thirst for knowledge, was to acquire a profession that would permit her to bring an end to her miserable marriage, arranged when she was 16. She succeeded in both her personal quests, and you may be able to tell that I really enjoyed her autobiography. She succeeded in both of her personal quests, becoming the director of a Jewish school for girls in Warsaw, a feminist and Zionist activist, and a successful translator. She translated Leon Trotsky's memoirs into Yiddish. Around 1900, Shana Korngold, the older sister of Golda Meir, fought her mother for the right to study instead of being apprenticed as a seamstress. The existence of a school for poor Jewish children enabled her to win the battle and, as she later commented in her memoirs, to change her life. In the turbulent world of Russian Jewry at the turn of the 20th century, women took particular advantage of those political movements that offered them opportunities for activism and for leadership. Like their brothers, young Jewish women who had broken with traditional religion were dazzled by the array of ideological parties that sought to improve the status and condition of the Jews and/or transform Russian society through revolution. Jewish youth who remained socially and emotionally connected to other Jews and to the Jewish community had a number of choices. They could join the Bund, the Jewish wing of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, that advocated a socialist revolution and the achievement of national cultural autonomy in Russia for the Yiddish-speaking masses of the working class. They could affiliate with any of the various wings of the Zionist movement, which sought to reestablish the Jews as an independent people in their ancestral homeland. Or they could become adherents of territorialism, which recognized the Jews as a national entity, but rejected the assertion of Palestine as the only or best territory appropriate for the rescue of Jews. Of all these options, politicized Jewish women seem to have been disproportionately drawn to the Bund because of its inclusion of women in leadership positions. When the General Jewish Labor Union in Russia and Poland, familiarly known as the Bund, was established in 1897 in a clandestine meeting on the outskirts of Vilna, 2 women were among the 13 founding delegates. The historian Henry Tobias's biographical notes of the most important early Bundists include 6 women among the 48 figures listed. Even more important was the number of women in the middle ranks of leadership. Women were involved as organizers of workers, as writers for the cause, and as couriers for political messages, smuggling information hidden in their voluminous skirts. Indeed, women were particularly useful in clandestine activities like smuggling because of the gender assumptions of the day that presumed that women did not have a developed political consciousness. Although gender was never a major analytical category for Bundist intellectuals and activists, the movement was committed in theory to equality of the sexes, an equality that would be achieved as a matter of course as a consequence of the socialist revolution. That commitment to gender equality was important to women Bundists, who, in breaking with traditional patterns of family life, and often with their families of origin, sought assurances that along with their male comrades, they would have a chance to influence the course of history. The Zionist movement also recruited young women to its cause. The first Zionist Congress that took place, like the founding of the Bund, in 1897, but in Switzerland and not in Russia, included about a dozen women among its 200 to 250 delegates. But in Tsarist Russia and later in interwar Poland, the movement seems to have been less successful than the Bund in promoting women within the leadership ranks. Zionist leaders frequently lamented their failure to attract the active support of the masses of Jewish women. The reluctance of the Orthodox Mizrahi movement to recognize women as potential leaders and the tendency of male chalutzim, pioneers, in Hakshara centers to prepare them for Aliyah to Palestine, the tendency of these chalutzim to treat their female colleagues like maids contributed to diminish the allure of Zionism for women seeking avenues of political activism. Although secular Zionist organizations attempted to present Zionism as a movement for all Jews, they had lost momentum to other political groups that more aggressively rejected the gendered divisions of traditional Jewish society. Some Jewish women found in feminism the ideology that best analyzed their own situation and provided a platform for the attainment of economic, social, and political equality. In 1918, poor Rakovsky again, published a pamphlet, The Jewish Woman, that combined feminism with Zionism. Asserting the importance of women's activity in movements for social reform, she lamented the minimal role that women of her time were playing in the Zionist movement, despite the fact that Herzl's political Zionism had 20 years before given them voting rights. Women, however, had not taken advantage of these rights. She attributed their detachment from Zionist activity to the issue with which I began this lecture, the failure of Jews, both Orthodox and assimilated, to provide a Jewish education for their daughters. She also blamed Orthodox attitudes. Jewish women of her day, she noted with regret, lacked a feeling, the feeling of Jewishness, dechush hayadus, the Jewish spark that the simple cheder, for all its faults, had implanted in children. She expressed her conviction as a Zionist and an educator that politically and socially mature Jewish women would recognize that the Jewish question, and with it the woman question, would be solved only through self-determination and not through assimilation. To achieve this double goal, she called for a national Jewish women's organization with branches throughout Poland to be founded and led by women themselves, and also for the realization of the Paula E platform plank in support of women's suffrage in Jewish communal elections. This proposal, by an avowed secular Jewish nationalist, was couched in terms that appealed specifically to Jewish pride. It is not possible, claimed Rakovsky, that we Jews, who were the first bearers of democratic principles, should in this regard stand apart from all civilized peoples and close the way for women to achievement of equal rights and to the first step in that direction, to participation in the community. There is evidence that by the 1920s, Rakovsky's vision of a national Jewish women's movement had been partially realized. At the very least, there existed a cadre of Jewish feminine activists centered in Warsaw who published pamphlets in Yiddish, among them the Modern Women's Movement, under the imprint of the publishing house of the Jewish Women's Association in Poland. A newspaper entitled Frauenstimme, Woman's Voice, also appeared in the middle of the decade. Jewish feminists sought to persuade their female audience that they had to organize to make their needs known. For the major Jewish political options of the time regularly subordinated women's issues to their central goal, whether that be socialist revolution in Russia or the building of the Yishuv in Palestine. Pointing to the international women's movement, feminists argued that women shared similar problems throughout the industrial world. These could be solved, in Poland as elsewhere, only through women organizing on their own behalf to secure civic and political equality, equal right to work and equal pay, and equal opportunities for education. One pamphlet highlighted the suffering of Jewish women from syphilis and called upon an unusual triad of doctors, rabbis, and socialists to address the problem. Other feminist writings dealt with issues of specifically Jewish concern, such as the problem of the aguna, the chained wife unable to remarry because she could not acquire a valid Jewish divorce, or the question of the struggle for women's suffrage in Palestine. The Jewish woman, wrote one activist, Rachel Kaplan-Maminsky, was wounded on 3 fronts: as a woman, as a Jew, and as a human being. Celebrating women's potential for effective social action, she concluded her pamphlet with a powerful combination of radical rhetoric and Jewish imagery. Let woman rise up. She is going to pluck the apple from the tree of life. Despite the recognized lure of secular movements among Jewish women and the deleterious effects of inadequate Jewish education, Jewish male leadership in Eastern Europe did not give the same attention to women in their published pronouncements as did their counterparts in the West. There were occasional articles in the Hebrew and Yiddish press about the social problem of prostitution or about such exotic figures as a young Jewish female anarchist assassin. Some newspapers also covered general women's issues as a regular part of their journalistic beat. In the first 6 months of 1913, for example, the Yiddish daily Der Freund, published in St. Petersburg, included articles on the women's suffrage movement in England, on women lawyers, on women's voting rights around the world, on women and world peace, and on Jews and the white slave trade. One article pointed out that modern women were dissatisfied with their lot all over the world, and with more and more of them entering the workforce, this is 1913, could no longer be thought of only as wives and mothers. Yet Jewish journalists did not focus on Jewish women when they chose to write about women's issues. And most importantly, Jewish leaders in Eastern Europe did not blame women for the defections from traditional practice that were occurring in their communities. In the Hebrew and Yiddish press of the late 19th and 20th century that I surveyed, and that's admittedly a small sample, references to the roles of Jewish women were few and far between. Only one signed opinion piece that appeared in Der Freund in 1913 criticized the reversal of fortune of Jewish men and women. Where once Jewish men had studied while their wives worked to support them, now the women, who were better educated in secular culture and more elegant than their husbands, lived a life of leisure. Jewish women, claimed the writer, were taking revenge on Jewish men for their former sins. Even this article, however, written in a tone of abject self-pity and irony, avoided calling for women to assume responsibility for Jewish cultural transmission. The absence of a communal debate on the roles of women, it seems to me, reflects the fact that East European Jewry was still at the beginning of the process of acculturation, and that the structural features of the societies in which Jews lived limited the possibilities of full assimilation. However secular some Jewish men and women had become, their acculturation and social integration were not perceived as a meaningful threat to Jewish group survival. Even secularized Jews were likely to retain a strong ethnic Jewish identity, generated internally and reinforced from without. The problems that communal leaders identified as deserving of immediate attention, therefore, were not issues of assimilation, but questions of securing economic and political equality for their vulnerable constituents, of solving the Jewish problem through nationalism, socialist revolution, or emigration. Such matters fell in the domain of public policy, from which both Jewish and general society tended to exclude women and their particular concerns. When East European Jews migrated en masse to the United States in the last decades of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th, assimilation became a more highly charged issue than it had been in their countries of origin. But in the immigrant community, as in Eastern Europe, women were not the focus of communal debate. The values of East European Jewish culture, transplanted to America and gradually transformed in an interaction with America, permitted women to play a complex role in the accommodation of their families to the conditions of American society. In some ways, Jewish women were agents of assimilation. In others, buffers against the disruptive influences of the new society. The image of the conservative immigrant woman, reluctant to cast off her wig, appeared in English-language immigrant fiction and memoirs. Yet, as the historian Andrew Hines has pointed out in his recent book, Adapting to Abundance, the easy availability of consumer goods, promoted by skillful advertising, facilitated Americanization of women as well as men. The new immigrant could easily acquire the external signs of the American, and most exchanged the European clothing of the greenhorn for stylish American garb soon after their arrival. As the family member most responsible for decisions about purchases, both major and minor, the woman presided over a process of acquisition that provided immigrants with the markers of American identity and mobility, from American food products to a piano for the parlor. Hines has suggested that immigrant Jewish women were particularly adept at strategic consumption because of their extensive experience with the marketplace in their shtetls and cities of origin. Indeed, urban America offered countless seductive secular pursuits to immigrant Jewish women. The lure of fashion was compelling to Jewish working girls, especially those employed in the garment industry, which was the industry that employed most Jewish immigrants. As one immigrant woman recalled of her youth and her attraction to American fashion, "We used to love the American people, to copy them. I wanted to be an American very much. I saw people who looked better and dressed better, and I wanted to be like them." Like their fellow workers, immigrant Jewish women also frequented the dance halls, movies, and amusement parks that provided leisure time diversion to working class youth. Sharing the Jewish passion for education, they enrolled in adult education evening classes in disproportionately large numbers and attended myriad lectures. Even when they remained within ethnic enclaves on the Lower East Side, they spent their time in coffee houses or at the Yiddish theater, certainly secular institutions. America offered them the freedom to experiment with an array of secular activities. The norms of East European Jewish culture that had permitted women to play a role in the secular public sphere, as well as women's pre-migration experience with work and politics, had an impact upon their lives in the American immigrant community, fostering an openness to issues that went beyond their domestic concerns. American social reformers who commented upon immigrant women noted that Jewish women were far more attuned to political questions and far more convinced of their right to act politically than were their immigrant neighbors and shopmates of different ethnic origins. The immigrant Jewish community repeatedly expressed its support of women's activism, rallying behind the female-initiated and led kosher meat boycott of 1902 in New York, for example, the female-led rent strikes, and the women participants in the Great Garment Strikes of 1909, and supporting women's suffrage at the polls in New York City to an extent that exceeded that of any other immigrant group. The women's page of the Jewish Daily Forward, the most popular Yiddish paper in America, reinforced the concept of the appropriateness of women active in the world of work and politics. Unlike the English language press, the Forward did not presume that women's interests could be contained within the rubrics of fashion and home economics. Rather, its editors constructed a secular, moderately socialist vision of Jewish womanhood, providing information on politics, the labor movement, and the international women's movement, and calling for women to participate in all three areas. This communal acceptance of women as active subjects rather than passive objects of history recognized and promoted the place of women as partners in negotiating the public role of Jews in American society. Despite their endorsement of women's public roles, most immigrant Jewish leaders recognized that women's primary influence was within the home. Jewish leaders turned to immigrant housewives to instruct them in the rearing of their American children and to suggest means for the creation of intergenerational harmony. Immigrants in American cities had available in the teens and 20s of this century a wealth of books and journals in Yiddish that offered advice on subjects as varied as hygiene, table manners, sexuality, fashion, parenting, and birth control. Although we cannot know how immigrant readers responded to this material, The very popularity of Margaret Sanger's pamphlet on birth control, for example, which was repeatedly reprinted, and the popularity of books of etiquette suggests that immigrants sought to familiarize themselves with the new options and the expectations of life in America. These advice manuals, books, and journals were overwhelmingly secular in their orientation. Their goal was to facilitate the adaptation of their readers to the conditions that confronted them in their new homes. Jewish identity, it was assumed, would take care of itself. Indeed, the advice literature presumed that migration necessitated a break with the culture of the old country, that it offered the welcome possibility of liberation from traditional constraints. The advice manuals also recognized that immigrant Jews sought to achieve middle-class status. Immigrant men and women would have to be educated in the niceties of middle-class social behavior. By learning good manners, immigrant Jews would become good Americans and would earn the respect of Gentile society. Although the task of adapting to middle-class American standards of good taste fell upon both men and women, advice literature tended to address women on specific issues more often than men. The popular Yiddish book Etikette, written by an Orthodox journalist under the pseudonym Tashrak, focused upon female fashion lapses, for example. It is dreadful what bad taste most of our Jewish girls have, it noted. Presumably, the self-presentation of women through their style of dress and behavior was a primary signifier of American social status. Tashrak also called upon Jewish women to avoid the path of the modern women's movement, which confused freedom with permissiveness. Instead, he promoted a traditional view of women's needs and of male-female relations. For thousands of years, he proclaimed with approbation, woman has been the weaker sex, dependent upon man, abandoned to his protection. The greatest, most prominent, and most educated woman wants a husband who will be, at least in some respects, superior to her. Advice literature in books and journals dealt with many female responsibilities, but women's role in the transmission of Judaism and Jewish culture was conspicuously absent. Chaim Malitz's 1918 book, Die Heim und die Frau, The Home and the Woman, written with great respect for traditional Jewish values and with the stated purpose of encouraging marriage and family life, exhorted the Jewish wife to be a balabosta, an efficient housewife. She was to keep her house clean and always to be busy in order to make her husband, who slaved all day in factory or store, feel like a king at home. Malitz expressed notions of a strict division of labor between husband and wife and of female moral superiority, and presented a sentimentalized view of the mother that reflected the bourgeois ideal. A wife, in his opinion, enjoyed enormous powers of persuasion. A wife can make of her husband all that she wants, he declared. But even he, while recognizing the importance of mothers in teaching their children to be honorable and good people, refrained from attributing to them any responsibility for their education as Jews, a subject he does not address at all. The Frauenjournal, a monthly journal published in the early 1920s and aimed specifically at immigrant women and their English-speaking daughters, included articles on Jewish holidays and on women in the Bible and Talmud. However, the articles appear to have been published for the purpose of edification of the readers and to convey to them that women had always been included in Jewish life. Articles on child rearing were concerned with hygiene, not Torah. The stated aim of the journal was to bridge the gap between the generations, particularly by encouraging mothers and daughters to select together patterns for the latest fashions, lavishly illustrated in the pages of the magazine. Preserving the Jewish family's reputation, as well as the reality of domestic harmony, was primarily a woman's task. The representation of immigrant Jewish women in the fiction and memoirs written by immigrants themselves or their children also celebrates Jewish women, and particularly mothers, as the physical and psychological supporters of their families, but not, again, as the transmitters of Jewish culture. In her stereotypical image, the Yiddish mama was a model of self-sacrifice for her children and a marvel of domestic wizardry. In his 1930 novel, The Mother, Sholem Asch extolled the mother's miraculous feats as a provider living in poverty. They were wonderful, those cooking pots of mothers. She gave them cold water, and the pots yielded yesterday's carrot soup anew. She gave them boiling water, and the pots returned a royal dish. Just one formula of extortion did mother possess for use on her pots: a sigh. When the pots heard mother sigh, it was as though she had repeated a secret incantation over them, with which she adjured them to supply the pitifully meager bit of nourishment, which was all she demanded for her large brood. The Yiddish mama was also the emotional center of her family. Alfred Kazin offered a paradigmatic portrait of this facet of the immigrant mother's role in his memoir, A Walker in the City. The kitchen gave a special character to our lives, my mother's character. All my memories of that kitchen are dominated by the nearness of my mother sitting all day long at her sewing machine. Year by year, as I began to take in her fantastic capacity for labor and her anxious zeal, I realized it was ourselves she kept stitched together. While Kazin was writing nostalgically in the early 1950s, the Yiddish mama had entered American popular culture in the 1920s through such vehicles as the jazz singer, in both stage and film versions, and Sophie Tucker's rendition of the song, My Yiddish Mama. This idealized representation of the immigrant Jewish mother as an undefeated source of strength was qualified by other early literary portraits. Sometimes her children sympathetically presented the immigrant mother as a victim of grinding poverty in the slums or of the patriarchal authority enshrined in traditional Judaism. Michael Gold, for example, in his autobiographical novel, Jews Without Money, laments the suffering of his hardworking mother and of their female neighbors, who slaved from dawn till midnight, cooking and cleaning at home, then working in the store. For this communist writer, the Jewish mother becomes the symbol of the sins of capitalism. In Bread Givers, her best-known novel, the writer Anja Jezierska depicted a mother so subordinated by the personality and male privilege of her tyrannical Talmud scholar husband that she was unable to serve as a real model for any of her daughters. Nor was she able to prevent the bartering of two of them in marriages that were to the financial advantage of their father. In her short stories, Jezierska also wrote of the economic struggles of strong but coarse immigrant Jewish mothers and of the bitterness of a social mobility that estranged mothers from their children. In the last years of the 1930s, leftist authors like Clifford Odets represented the immigrant Jewish mother as a symbol of the bourgeois values that had to be opposed, as a force inculcating a materialistic drive in her children. Despite the multiplicity of representations of the immigrant Jewish mother, the image of the Yiddish mama prevailed, perhaps because she served as a useful foil to the far more negative stereotypes of the second and third generation American Jewish woman that were to emerge largely after the Second World War. Memoirs and recent studies based upon oral histories also tend to remember the immigrant mother in images that resemble the Yiddish mama, though in less idealized terms. Looking back, the children of immigrants express appreciation for their mother's efforts to sustain their families amidst poverty and squalor. Although their home experiences differ, most see their mothers as mediators between the home and the larger society of school, work, and recreation, even if, because their style was foreign, they could not serve as explicit role models for adult life in America. Far from being rigidly conservative in their views of their children's behavior, mothers are remembered, at least by their daughters, as being generally supportive of their children's aspirations and desires for independence and education. Perhaps immigrant mothers could be more flexible regarding their children's self-assertion because the experience of migration was less traumatic for them than for their husbands. As in the case of the middle-class Jewish women of Western and Central Europe in America, their primary domestic role shielded them from immediate demands to abandon traditional Jewish practice to earn a living and achieve social mobility. The female ideal of the Balabusta differed little from Minsk to the Lower East Side. Because of her acknowledged centrality in the home, the immigrant Jewish woman may have suffered less loss of self-esteem than her husband, who initially at least eked out a living in the far from prestigious occupations of tailor or peddler. Moreover, one element of social status available to men within Eastern European Jewish society, mastery of rabbinic texts, did not survive the overseas migration. Although immigrant mothers and fathers both experienced conflict with their Americanized children, who often viewed them with embarrassment, the maternal caretaking role may have preserved effective ties in the home between mothers and their growing offspring. The immigrant generation had two major concerns: economic survival in the new land and accommodation to the norms of American life. As they strove to achieve the twin goals of economic security and Americanization, Jewish women and men saw their roles as different but complementary. All Jews, whether philanthropists and social reformers of the already established American Jewish community or the immigrants themselves, all of them recognized acculturation as a necessity for the achievement by immigrant newcomers of a stable position in America. In the context of the immigrant experience, as in the East European Jewish community, the process of assimilation had not yet exceeded the goals of the Jewish leaders who articulated the project of assimilation. While Jewish spokesmen in Eastern Europe had begun to reflect on the negative consequences of the more rapid secularization of Jewish girls than boys, in the first immigrant generation in America, Jewish education for children of either sex was low on the parental agenda. With the public schools, which were the primary instrument of Americanization, open to girls as well as to boys, the issue of gender in the process of assimilation attracted no attention. With the emergence of second-generation Jews as a prominent force within American Jewry in the 1920s, the American Jewish community, as we saw in the last lecture, adopted the understanding of gender roles that characterized middle-class Jews in all countries of the industrialized West. The Balabusta gave way to the Jewish priestess in her home, and the Yiddish mama of song and story was eventually transmuted into Sophie Portnoy.